And I'm happy to welcome you to IPI's Distinguished Author Series. Tonight, featuring Michael Weiss, co-author with Hassan Hassan of ISIS, Inside the Army of Terror. This is indeed an inside story because the authors talk directly to the ISIS people themselves, to the clerics, to the fighters, security officials, and to the sympathizers. They trace the beginnings and the development of these people's involvement and dedication to ISIS and record chillingly their abiding faith in the tenets of jihadism and belief in the extraordinarily savage tactics that they employ. The authors show how the very acts that appall us allure many of them. This is not a book of confessions or apologies for what these people have done. It is rather an unblinking account of how they believe in the enterprise, its conduct, and the certainty of its success. While the authors certainly don't share those convictions, they do end up convinced of ISIS's capacity to endure. The book concludes with the phrase, "The army of terror will be with us indefinitely." So it's crucial to try to understand it. And after the appearance here last month of our last distinguished author, New York Times columnist Nick Kristof, I set out with the idea of devoting this month's book talk to the subject of ISIS. There are a lot of books out there on this subject, good books, but the one I kept hearing the most promising notice of, particularly for its reliance on first-hand sources, was this one. And I saw in his many television appearances how well Michael Weiss presented it. You probably also saw just now that the New York Times reviewed the book favorably last Friday and again 2 days later in the Sunday Book Review. I should mention at this point that the book is for sale at the door, and by the way, it's paperback and it only sets you back $15. And I will make sure we finish by 7:45 so that Michael has a chance to sign purchase books and chat with you. Michael Weiss is an American journalist who has covered Syria from the outset of the revolution there in 2011. And Hassan Hassan is a Syrian analyst at the Delma Institute in Abu Dhabi. The book is at once scholarly and anecdotal, and it evidences the full range of the author's thoroughgoing knowledge of the history and cultures of Iraq and Syria, and their ability to wrest insight from closely observed events and strategically conducted interviews. Finally, and you will hear this when Michael speaks, and see it if you read the book, they have refined all of this into an accessible and compelling narrative. The book is very much a collaboration, and Hassan and Michael have been presenting the book here in sort of a tag team way. Hassan was in this country last month, and Michael is here now. We are very happy that Michael is here with us tonight, so please join me in welcoming to IPI Michael Weiss, co-author of ISIS, Inside the Army of Terror.
Thank you very much, Warren, and the Institute for hosting me. It's a great honor to be here. I thought I'd begin by giving you a taste of the personal before I get into a taste of the world historical. Hassan and I both have a vested interest in this subject matter. For Hassan, it's because he is a Syrian national. He has seen in the last 4 and some years that his entire country has been essentially burnt to the ground. It no longer exists in anything but name only. Not only that, and this is actually something that came to light in the course of actually finishing up the book, he's from a town called Abu Kamal, which is on the border of Syria and Iraq. To put this into some context, for the better part of a decade, this town has served as a gateway portal for jihadists moving first from Iraq, or rather from Syria into Iraq, to wage war against the coalition forces and then also the Iraqi government and security forces. And then over the past, say, half decade in the reverse direction. So from Iraq into Syria. So it's like if you were covering the Mexican drug cartel, it's like being from Juarez, and trying to understand the nature of this conflict. For myself, As Warren mentioned, I was covering the Syrian revolution from the outset and got to know members of the protest movement, activists, standing up against the Assad regime in the early days. And I found a remarkable unanimity of opinion about what they wanted from a future Syria. This was at a time when the Egyptian revolution was starting to, go in a more Islamist direction with the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood. There was a lot of skepticism about what these cataclysms in the region were going to produce. And I was actually rather impressed that in the case of Syria, there was more or less a kind of a unified view. And I interviewed by proxy, actually, a protest leader from every major city, including Damascus. One of the mythologies was that, this was a sort of peasant-led revolution that occurred in the sort of countryside or rural areas. No, in fact, it got started in the capital itself, in the old city of Damascus. I traveled to Aleppo with what was then known as a catch-all, of course, the Free Syrian Army, in Ramadan of 2012. So this was July to August. And my wife, who sat in the front row, nearly divorced me for doing it, and it's something I would never do again. But I was also remarkably touched by what I saw, and it wasn't because of the military component of it. By this time, of course, it had become an armed insurrection. What I saw was still the embryo of a civil society or democratic culture in Syria beginning to take root. I stayed in a town called Al-Bab, which is about an hour's drive north of Aleppo city. The city of Aleppo, the northern quadrant at least, had just been liberated by the FSA by this point. We spent the night in Al-Bab, and at night it was extraordinary because even though there were military or FSA checkpoints, the entire city transformed into a kind of spontaneous municipal government. So you had children as young as 14 years old on motorbikes, donning white gloves, picking up garbage bags, and actually doing a kind of de facto sanitation service for this town. The town itself had been bombed mercilessly around the clock by the Assad regime, hit by Sukhoi fighter jets and helicopters. The hospital of the town was actually targeted by the regime to keep it from doing any kind of medical services. So the people inside the mosque created a sort of makeshift field hospital, which treated not only FSA soldiers coming back from the front and activists who were killed, but also members of the regime, Syrian soldiers and so-called Shabiha, which were the more notorious mercenary gangs employed by Assad who conducted some of the worst atrocities of the conflict. When I was there, I saw no jihadis. I'm sure there were people who had Islamist or even jihadi sympathies. As I'll get into in a minute, ISIS was in Syria long before they were in Syria, quote unquote. But it was very encouraging. And in fact, I met a guy, Barry, he goes by, who spoke fluent English and was taking me around, showing me. I asked challenging, critical questions. I got answers. And at one point he turns to me and he says, "You see, Michael, now you can be the first half Christian, half Jewish member of Al-Qaeda," in a very sardonic manner. Because, of course, this was the Assad's regime's propaganda from the start. We're facing radical jihadists backed by a rather forbidding coalition of the willing, including the United States, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey. So the lie for what was the regime narrative from the beginning was very easy to expose. A year later, Al-Bab had been taken over by ISIS. The safe house that I stayed in is now property of ISIS. The family I stayed with fled their own hometown and their own property and now live in Turkey. And Barry, I got in touch with for the writing of this book, gave me a play-by-play of just how they managed to take over the town. It was done in a very skillful and adroit manner. This wasn't a sort of blitzkrieg. They planned, they plotted, they bided their time. And essentially just, it was a very slow-going absorption. This is the tragedy to me of Syria, because right now the narrative of this conflict is this was always a jihadist operation from the beginning. These were Zarqawas, radical Islamists, who wanted to take down the Assad regime. The Assad regime had a very carefully planned script which actually enabled the rise of groups such as ISIS, including ISIS. So what is this organization, and what was the real reason behind kind of putting pen to paper? I would do television interviews in the fall after the brutal beheading of James Foley, the American journalist, which essentially kick-started this new war waged by the United States, or led by the United States. And the question I kept hearing from TV presenters was, where did they come from? How comes it that this group no one's ever heard of in the space of a year has managed to conquer terrain roughly the size of Great Britain? And it was an understandable question, but it was also a fairly strange one. I mean, the United States has been at war with ISIS for 11 years. It just had a different name. It used to be Al-Qaeda in Iraq. So it's sort of like we put in the book, if the Viet Cong had come back and conquered 1/3 of Southeast Asia in 1985, but called themselves, the Army of Indo-Chinese Communism, and people in the Reagan administration were scratching their heads saying, who are these guys and where did they come from? Same insurgency, perhaps different tactics and different personnel. So let's go back to the beginning. Even before the US invasion of Iraq, Al-Qaeda was planning for a region-wide war, a region-wide conflict. Osama bin Laden himself knew that this war was coming. But it wasn't really bin Laden's franchise, or it wasn't his operation. Al-Qaeda in Iraq was founded by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, a Jordanian jihadist who got his start in almost a Keystone Cops kind of manner. He went to Afghanistan twice. The first time didn't have much to show for it. He arrived just as the Soviets were being driven out of the country. So he became a correspondent, writing reports and living vicariously through the Mujahideen that had actually fought the Red Army. Went back to Jordan, founded a very obscure and sort of go-nowhere terrorist group, was immediately broken up, that group, by the Jordanian security services, the GID. Zarqawi and his spiritual mentor were thrown in prison. They got out of prison in 1994 under general amnesty, which coincided with the ascension to the throne of King Abdullah, the current monarch of Jordan. But in prison, I would argue this was the formative experience for Zarqawi. Not only did this hone his skills as a leader of men, he was a charismatic guy, but he wasn't a particularly bright man. But it gave him the sort of gangland following that he needed in order to build a cell and build a network and franchise. It was also in prison, allegedly, that he first gained the attention of one Osama bin Laden, who was reading some of Zarqawi's writings posted to the internet after they were smuggled out of the prison. Zarqawi went back to Afghanistan in 1999 and met bin Laden in Kandahar. And the two of them hated each other. Why did they hate each other? Without getting into too much of the arcana of jihadi theory or jihadi ideology, for bin Laden, the goal was not, kill Muslims, conduct genocidal operations against the Shia, or even necessarily, attack in a most vicious manner some of the so-called apostate Arab regimes. Now, it's true, Ayman al-Zawahiri, Zarqawi's lieutenant, was one of the key members. He was the leader, in fact, of Egyptian Islamic Jihad. But the ideology of al-Qaeda had transformed from being one of attacking these Arab regimes to attacking what they saw as the ultimate patron and the greater enemy, which was the United States. For Zarqawi, no. It was always about Jordan. He wanted to overthrow the Hashemite monarchy. He wanted to spread Islamist ideology and conduct these revolutions throughout the region. There was another problem, which was Zarqawi considered the Shia, which is the minority sect of Islam, to be heretics, to be worse than Christians, worse than American infidels. This offended bin Laden because bin Laden's mother was a Syrian Alawite. It was an offshoot or schismatic sect of Shia Islam. Nonetheless, people within al-Qaeda thought that Zarqawi would be useful because not only had he got out of prison in Jordan, which was, again, this incubator recruitment ground for radical jihadism, but he had a great Levantine network of Jordanian jihadis who would follow him anywhere. So with a startup loan from al-Qaeda, from about $200,000, Zarqawi founded a training camp in Afghanistan. Not much went on there, although people within al-Qaeda later testified to US security services that the progress being made was actually quite extraordinary for a guy who seemingly came out of nowhere for operating with a very minimal budget. After 9/11, the US goes to war in Afghanistan. They knock out the Taliban. Al-Qaeda sort of spreads, diverts resources into southern Pakistan. Zarqawi makes his way from Afghanistan into northern Iraq. Actually, even before that, was hosted in Iran for a time. And the sort of his history during this period when he was in Iran is somewhat murky. Jordanian security services, in a profile in The Atlantic several years ago, just before Zarqawi was killed, the profile actually ends with this rather wry and forbidding quote, which says, "We don't understand why is the United States going to war in Iraq. We have no evidence to suggest Saddam Hussein is in bed with al-Qaeda. It's true he has an opportunistic relationship with other Islamist organizations. He's funding suicide bombers or paying the families of martyrs in the Palestinian territories and so on. But don't they realize it's Iran that has a more tactical relationship with al-Qaeda, and it's Iran that Zarqawi is working with at the moment." Well, mark the sequel. Zarqawi goes into northern Iraq, sets up a small Islamist militant organization, which actually takes on and absorbs other Islamist organizations. But the franchise that he founds by 2003, coincidental with the US invasion, is called Monotheism and Jihad. Not quite yet a member of Al-Qaeda or a franchise of Al-Qaeda, but what you might call a loose affiliate. Again, they founded his training camp for him. The first big attacks that Zarqawi waged in 2004 were against the UN embassy in Baghdad and also the Jordanian embassy, or rather the UN installation in Baghdad and the Jordanian embassy. Again, coming back to his roots as somebody who first and foremost wanted to see the overthrow of his own home government. The spectaculars waged by what was then not yet Al-Qaeda, this was a very marginal player in the so-called insurgency. The insurgency, a lot of mythology has grown up around this too, first largely as a result of Washington's propaganda about who these guys really were. It behooved the Bush administration at the time to say these were all foreign fighters coming in at the behest of Osama bin Laden. In fact, most of them were Iraqi nationals. Why were they joining the insurgency? Well, the US did three stupid things: invading Iraq, de-Baathification, and the disbandment of the Iraqi military. Those last two, literally with the stroke of a pen by L. Paul Bremer. What this in effect did was put paid to 40 years of a criminal mafia-style patronage system overseen by Saddam Hussein. Sunni generals, Sunni agents of the Mukhabarat, which is the intelligence services, Ba'ath Party officials, in many cases people who only joined the party to get ahead in whatever real profession they were plying their trade in, namely illegal or gray market economic smuggling activities, were rendered unemployed overnight. And literally, in some cases, these guys would go to the green zone and say, what do we do now? And they'd be told, well, you can drive a cab for a living. And you have to understand, it wasn't Iraq's economy as a mafia state. It wasn't about your paycheck. It was about the prestige and the political power you wielded as a member of the party and as a willing executioner of Saddam's regime. So it was about the money you would make supplemental to your income. So Saddam had erected an entire network throughout the course of the 1990s and right before the US invasion. The network really had twofold purposes. Number one, evade UN oil for food sanctions, right? Smuggle cars, smuggle oil, smuggle contraband goods in and out of the country. Izzat al-Duri, his vice president, was in charge of this apparatus and, set this network up in what you might call the geostrategic heartland of Iraq, which is the Sunni areas of northern central Iraq. The second purpose for these networks was what? Have a kind of guerrilla apparatus in place inside the country in the event that there is a domestic insurgency or insurrection. Namely, one mirroring the Shia 1991 or Kurdish uprising against the regime. Saddam was always fearful there was going to be a rebellion against him. And he always thought that this rebellion wouldn't just be nationalist in inflection, it would also be Islamist in inflection. People forget, because we refer to his regime as secular. In the 1990s, he inaugurated something called the Islamic Faith Campaign. What was this? Well, he thought, in order to forestall an Islamist challenge to my rule, the best course of action would be to somehow marry Islamism with Baathism. The problem with this Islamic Faith Campaign is that it graduated more Islamists or Salafi jihadis than it did a sort of Frankenstein hybrid of the two. So a lot of people who were working in the Ba'ath regime had more sympathies with what today we consider part of the Al-Qaeda firmament. So Saddam, in a sense, fashioned a noose for his own neck. He created elements that would become part of the so-called insurgency. Osama bin Laden is many things. He wasn't a stupid man. When the US went into Iraq, blundered into Iraq in 2003, he issued a fatwa. And part of the fatwa said, we will make an exception in this one case where the mujahideen, jihadis of the Al-Qaeda orientation, can become willing accomplices with what he called the socialist infidels, meaning the remnants of the Ba'ath regime. For this book, I talked to a number of military intelligence officers, such as Derek Harvey, Joel Rayburn, people whose job it was when the US occupation occurred to anatomize and track the insurgency. What they found was very interesting. Jihadis in some cases, the ones who would use these vehicle-borne IEDs, such as the one that hit the UN in 2004, the networks that they were exploiting were the same networks installed by Saddam Hussein and run by ex-members of the Ba'ath regime. So Izzat al-Duri's secular nationalist insurgency was working cheek by jowl with the Takfiris, the radical jihadis. Again, something we didn't quite apprehend at the time when US soldiers started to get killed and when we saw that this entire invasion and occupation was going sideways. But a very, very important point, because when we look at what ISIS is today, it is not just a terrorist organization, it is also a mafia, and it is also fundamentally a form of Sunni power political projection, right? Al-Qaeda in Iraq was officially founded in 2004 when Zarqawi, on the back of all of his spectacular terrorist successes, pledged allegiance to bin Laden. The pledge was accepted. Still very much a marginal player within the insurgency. The first problem he faced was what? There were really two foreign occupations of Iraq, the US and coalition occupation, and then this consortium of mujahideen fighters, in many cases from Jordan, from Egypt, from Syria, from Saudi Arabia, from Libya, from every country but Iraq. Because they were going after Shia, because they were going after de facto state institutions, the Iraqi government trying to reconstitute itself or build itself up from scratch, they started to alienate a lot of the population. Zarqawi's public relations conceit was the following. He tried to Iraqize his franchise. So right before his death, he inaugurated something called the Mujahideen Shura Council. And what this was is that all the domestic Islamists or the native Iraqi Islamist cells and organizations in the country would bundle themselves into the same umbrella, the Mujahideen Shura Council. But Al-Qaeda would be primus inter pares of this consortium. So in other words, Al-Qaeda would be the tip of the spear. It would actually lead and run the entire thing, but now with more Iraqi rank and file. Again, it really was more of a PR conceit than it was the reality. By 2006, Zarqawi is killed in a US strike abetted by Jordanian intelligence. They never lost track of their man. The two people who replaced him, one was an Egyptian national dispatched by Al-Qaeda. The other came out of nowhere, somebody called al-Baghdadi. People within central Al-Qaeda didn't know who this guy was. There have actually been communiques with bin Laden and Zawahiri saying, we don't know where this guy came from, he's not our man. What was happening by 2006? Zarqawi's franchise had so eclipsed global Al-Qaeda in terms of prestige, in terms of the ability to bleed the United States, and also in terms of financial resiliency. By 2006, Al-Qaeda in Iraq was more profitable than Al-Qaeda, such that even bin Laden was asking Zarqawi for a loan instead of the other way around. That it was an inevitable consequence that this franchise would actually become Iraqized. It would be taken over by Iraqis. Al-Baghdadi was an Iraqi national. US forces didn't realize or weren't sure that this guy even existed for a spell until finally they killed him in 2010 along with al-Masri, the Egyptian national who was leading. During this period, I know this sounds very kind of complex and arcane, but it's important to understand sort of the evolution of ISIS and the current structure of it today. During this period, you could already see a fissure emerging between Al-Qaeda and what was then known as the Islamic State of Iraq. Al-Masri was technically the head of Al-Qaeda. Al-Baghdadi, nominally his superior, but again, came out of nowhere, was leading this ultra-consortium called the Islamic State of Iraq, or ISI. The divorce between Al-Qaeda and ISI was there. I mean, it was a sort of trial separation, if you like, in connubial terms. When these two were killed in 2010, nobody knew what was going to happen. By 2010, the US had actually made progress in Iraq. You had the Anbar awakening, led by tribal sheikhs, who cast their lot with US forces only because US forces were seen to be non-sectarian and credible intercessory actors on the ground. So in other words, Al-Qaeda had so lorded it over this geostrategic heartland of Iraq, Anbar, Salahuddin province. They had monopolized the economy through which these Sunni tribes had made their fortune for centuries. Again, everything happens at either the black or the gray market. Al-Qaeda in Iraq, the reason they became so profitable is they were stealing from the people they were ruling. Also conducting rape, also assassinating prominent sheikhs. US forces would blow into town, and what would happen? They would expunge Al-Qaeda in Iraq, but the problem was they wouldn't stick around long enough. So by that point, the inhabitants of the town, they were still casting their lot with the insurgency. Al-Qaeda in Iraq would also, it was like playing whack-a-mole. They'd be expunged from one town, they'd pop up in another. Improvisationally, what we know today as the surge, what we know today as the awakening, this was not a top-down affair. This was not some genius at the Pentagon saying, let's implement the counterinsurgency doctrine. This was a brigade commander improvisation, town by town, jurisdiction by jurisdiction. When U.S. forces stuck around and conducted policing operations, the wary sheikhs and the tribes would realize, you know what? These guys are better than al-Qaeda. We don't like them. They're foreign occupiers in our land, but they're better than al-Qaeda. Other insurgencies, such as the 1920 Revolutions Brigade, which is a very nationalist-oriented anti-American insurgency. They even realized the U.S. was preferable to al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda's brutality, the sanguinary pursuit for what I would call a kind of Sunni maximalist or Sunni supremacist project in Iraq had so alienated even the Sunnis. So remember, Zarqawi hated who first and foremost? The Shia. His goal from the beginning was to foment a sectarian civil war by going after the Shia, blowing up their shrines, blowing up the Husseiniyyas, the mosques, conducting the beheadings live on camera, such that this would prompt a retaliatory strike by the Shia. Militia groups, death squads, the Badr organization, many of these names are familiar to us today for a very good reason. I'll get to that in a minute as well. They would come after the Sunnis, thus driving the Sunnis into al-Qaeda's embrace. But al-Qaeda overplayed its hand. U.S. forces on the ground exploited this overplaying of the hand, and that's how we managed to sort of turn the tide. By 2010, al-Qaeda in Iraq's leadership had been decimated. I think something like 6 in 10 key members in the leadership structure had either been captured on the field or killed. So things were making progress. The problem was, who was the prime minister of Iraq at this time? Nouri al-Maliki. There's an election in 2010. Maliki's state of law coalition or bloc does not win an outright majority. Ayad al-Awi's party does. This was the transitional prime minister. And if you talk to a lot of Sunnis today, they consider that election to have been stolen. Not just stolen, but the theft of that election abetted by the United States, which backed Maliki. There are all sorts of communications had at the White House level. The best book on this is The Endgame by Michael Gordon and Bernard Traynor. Joe Biden was in charge of Iraq. He's on record saying things like, well, Maliki hates the goddamn Sunnis, but let's back him anyway. So Sunnis allowed al-Qaeda in Iraq to reform, to reconstitute themselves, essentially out of a fundamental political grievance with the nature and the direction that Baghdad was heading in. And the U.S. was an accomplice, whether by accident or design, in the creation of these grievances. When the Syrian revolution kicked off in 2011, again, ISIS didn't have much of a presence. It's true that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who's now the head of ISIS, the guy who inherited the organization after the death of al-Masri and the first al-Baghdadi, dispatched a man called Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani into Syria in Ramadan of 2011. So around about a year after I was in Syria, ISIS already had operatives and agents and sleeper cells in the country. But Jawlani was smart. He didn't start conducting terrorist operations right away. There were a few that happened at the end of 2011 that still are sort of shrouded in mystery. Instead, he built a constituency. Assad played right into this hand, probably as a willing accomplice to the rise of radical jihadism by doing what? May 2011, he declares general amnesty purportedly to free Syrian political prisoners, but in actuality, freeing whom? Salafi jihadists, radical Islamists, the very people picked up in Syria, in many cases after returning to Iraq. How did they get to Iraq? Well, for the better part of a decade, Assad and his mukhabarat were facilitating transfers of jihadis into Iraq to not just target U.S. and coalition forces, but also the Maliki government. People don't understand this. They say, wait a minute, Maliki was a proxy of Iran or allied with Iran. Assad is also a proxy or client of Iran. How did the two of them hate each other? Well, that's the Middle East for you. Proxies and allies don't always get along. Assad is on record. I mean, there are people literally across the street from the U.S. Embassy in Damascus was a travel agency that would take mujahideen arriving at Damascus International Airport, bus them into the Jazeera, which is the part of eastern Syria, the desert region, which, not coincidentally, ISIS has made its de facto headquarters today, and then from there, arrange for al-Qaeda border emirs. These were jihadis, enemy agents of the United States, hosted with the succor of the Syrian government on Syrian soil. Border emirs would then dispatch them into Iraq. How do we know this relationship was going on? 2010, JSOC, Joint Special Operations Command, conducted a cross-border raid, very much like the one that killed bin Laden in Abbottabad, into Deir ez-Zor, into Abu Kamal, I believe, in eastern Syria, and killed one of these border emirs. And the Assad regime continued to deny that he was being hosted with their connivance. The general amnesty freed many of the players now in the Syrian insurgency, not just part of Jabhat al-Nusra, which is the official al-Qaeda franchise, but also ISIS, freed them knowing that they would get up to no good. Because again, you create a propaganda narrative. This is Baathism 101. This is what actually unites Saddam and Bashar. You create a propaganda narrative, and then you do everything in your power to make it so, to make it an accomplished fact. So in this book, we wanted to show, because again, this goes against the conventional wisdom and some of the sort of fashionable or received notions about how ISIS came to be. We wanted to show that actually the reason they have such a perch in Syria is because the Assad regime allowed them to gain that perch. The goal from the very beginning was destroy a peaceful, moderate, pro-Western or secular protest movement, and then when it became an armed insurgency, kill all the nationalist rebels. And by and large, the regime has succeeded. And this is why today, Syria no longer exists. 1/3 of the country is now occupied territory by an organization known as ISIS. But again, looking at this phenomenon, looking at this organization, strictly through the prism of counterterrorism, I think is a fool's errand. You have to understand who the players are at the top. You have to understand what is motivating recruitment. So the reason I went into all that history in the beginning is I want you to take away one thing. This is a fundamentally Iraqized army. Right? The players at the very top, with the exception of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi himself, come from where? The Ba'athist regime of Saddam Hussein. Okay? They were agents in the Mukhabarat. They were officers in the Iraqi military. They were agents of Izzat al-Duri, and they know exactly where the car and oil and contraband and weapons smuggling rings are. How did ISIS manage to conquer Mosul, the second city in Syria, population 1 to 2 million people? They had help on the ground. They had help on the ground not just in the form of fellow travelers and agents of influence who were not necessarily jihadists themselves. Izzat al-Duri's Naqshbandi army, which is a Ba'athist insurgency, worked cheek by jowl with ISIS in June of 2014 to conquer Mosul. And now, of course, ISIS is liquidating the stock, very Ba'athist style, killing out all of al-Duri's men. The Sunnis in Iraq, again, they opened their door to exactly the barbarous terroristic franchise that they had once expelled, only because what was the alternative? Baghdad under Maliki, that's a worse oppressor in their mind. So in studying the recruitment of this organization, if I'm going too long, just let me know. We set out to understand what were the motives for people linking up. We opened the book with an anecdote. Abdulaziz, he's a Syrian national by heritage, but he was living in Bahrain for most of his adolescence. He went to Syria in 2011. He joined with what was then the Free Syrian Army, or some brigade within it, became disillusioned with them, joined up with another Islamist organization, didn't quite like the cut of their jib either, went back home to Bahrain. His parents were very worried. They took his passport away, but it was too late. Abdulaziz had made contact with the brothers using social media, the internet, whatever communication device, probably Skype, who were then setting up shop in Raqqa. They told him, come back. Come back and see the real revolution. Join the real future of this country. Join the real future of the region, which is going to be the caliphate. For some reason we couldn't quite apprehend, Abdulaziz's parents finally ceded his passport. He went back. He joined with ISIS, and he said to us, look, I wasn't a particularly pious Muslim in 2011. I joined the Nationalist Free Syrian Army. A lot of those guys were defectors from the secular Syrian military. ISIS showed me the true path of Islam. Talking to them, listening to their clerics, he didn't use the word being indoctrinated, but this is what the thing was. It was like the scales fell from my eyes, and finally I understood the world as it should be. This reminds me of nothing so much as every story by every anti-communist, ex-communist, The God That Failed, Arthur Koestler, The Captive Mind by Czeslaw Miłosz, which I've been rereading and finding more about ISIS from that book than I have from a lot of news articles being written on the subject. You have to put yourself into the mind of a young Sunni. Similar to during the Cold War, right after World War II, putting yourself into the mind of, say, a member of the Polish intelligentsia. How does somebody who believes in the emancipation of women, freedom of speech, who in many cases might be an artist or a writer, how does he cast his lot with not just a totalitarian ideological movement, but a death cult which is founded on a slave economy, namely Stalinist Russia? What if he leaves his house in the morning and on his way to buy bread from the shop doesn't know if he's going to be picked up by the secret police and spirited off to some dungeon in his homeland, or even worse, to the gulag in Siberia? What does that do to the psyche? How does it destroy the moral imagination? A lot of the people that are joining ISIS, they don't set out in life to be jihadis. If you had shown them images in 2009 of a Jordanian airman being set alight in a cage, they would have been just as appalled as everyone else in this room. The war in Syria, and also in some cases the war in Iraq, has destroyed generations of young Arabs, particularly Sunnis. There was a good study conducted by Quantum, which happens to be a communications firm that puts out Now Lebanon, one of the magazines I write for, which found that the number one attraction for people joining ISIS was a sense of rectifying Sunni political grievances. Why does this make me even more pessimistic than I already am, having authored a book about the most formidable terrorist organization on the planet? Because right now, the US's current foreign policy, again, whether by accident or design, is doing everything it can to further alienate and exacerbate Sunni political grievances. This deal we just struck with Iran, could argue it's a good deal on the merits of the nuclear file alone, but the indications, the messaging from the White House is this is about something bigger. This is about rapprochement with the Islamic Republic. If you are a young Sunni, having seen or lived through 4 years of attritional warfare in Bashar al-Assad's Syria, Scud missiles, sarin, chlorine gas dropped on your head, Shabia death squads gang raping your sister in front of you, taking your cousin into a prison, returning his mutilated corpse months later, being told, if you tell the truth about this, we'll come for the rest of your family. If you have lived through this, beg the United States some form of foreign intervention, or at least a no-fly zone to protect against the depravities of the regime. And then you go and you look in Iraq, the US has backed Maliki, the US is now flying warplanes in the same airspace as Iranian warplanes. The US has, although it denies it, de facto allied with Iranian-backed Shia militia groups, not just Shia militia groups, but the very Shia militia groups that Abu Musab al-Zarqawi hoped would kill and ethnically cleanse and dispossess the Iraqi Sunnis, thus prompting Sunnis to go into the fold of al-Qaeda in Iraq. Suddenly, the geopolitical optics become very bad. And the United States has not just become an indifferent actor or idle spectator to the plight of the Sunni Ummah. The United States has become complicit in the genocide of Sunnis. If you talk to people today, and I don't mean even just ISIS guys, this is what they say. I've been covering Syria for 4 years. In the beginning, it was, well, Obama doesn't want to help us because he supports Israel, and Israel is fine with Assad. He's kept the Golan quiet for 3 decades. Today, it's, no. Obama prefers the Shia to the Sunnis. He wants to deal with Iran. He wants to use the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard Corps, Quds Force, headed by Qasem Soleimani, to come and kill only us. This is like a bullet leaving the chamber of a gun and watching it travel in slow motion. If you thought 9/11 and the immediate aftermath of that was bad, you ain't seen nothing yet. And the reason for that is not just, again, these political grievances feeding into ISIS. But now, because of this divorce, which was consummated about a year ago, between al-Qaeda and ISIS is too brutal and has too many political ambitions even for al-Qaeda. The competition between these two organizations is going to be played out on the streets of Europe. It's already being played out in France, in Belgium. We've seen it in the Middle East and North Africa, in Tunisia, in Yemen, in Libya. Eventually, it'll come to the United States. We're now at a rate 1 per month. What does 1 stand for? Some major, or maybe not so major, but still rather terrifying terrorist operation that has been preempted or interrupted by very good counterterrorism police work. 1 per month. And we're also at a rate of 1 per month in the region of terrorist attacks perpetrated either by an al-Qaeda affiliate or franchise or by ISIS. In the case of France, within the space of, I think, 24 hours, 2 attacks, one done by AQAP, the other done by somebody who was at least inspired by ISIS. So this intra-jihadi competition, a game of one-upmanship, we are the sort of chessboard on which it's going to be played. And I've been talking to a lot of people in the US government, the State Department. How do we combat ISIS messaging? What is the counter-narrative? What is the propaganda? If we just expose the atrocities and tweet about beheadings and all that, that'll be enough. No, it won't be. What differentiates ISIS from every barbaric movement or ideology the region has ever seen, and by the way, I include in that Assad's Baathism and Saddam's Baathism, Marketing, that's it. That's it. You know, they want to exhibit, they want the voyeuristic component to what they do. They set a Jordanian airman alight in a cage because if you watch that entire video, it's not about that act. It's about what that man was putatively responsible for. Videos of Jordanian warplanes dropping bombs alongside UAE, Egyptian, Saudi warplanes on whom? Muslim babies. Again, and all with the connivance and the backing of the Crusader Imperial Army of the United States. It's a very powerful message if you believe the things that I tried to outline earlier, driving this recruitment effort. Again, you know, they're not the only ones doing these horrible things. This is an audience, I just want to, one question before we get into the proper Q&A. By a show of hands, is ISIS the only, does anyone here believe ISIS is the only group in either Syria or Iraq that's burning people alive right now? Just by a show of hands. Okay, good. Everyone here is smarter than people in US policymaking circles. The answer, of course, it's a trick question, is no. In Syria today, the National Defense Force, which is a consortium of Shia and Alawite militia groups, built by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Quds Force, locking people in their homes, Sunni families in some cases, whole families, including women and children, and then burning the houses to the ground. This is documented. So if you're a Sunni and you turn on CNN or the BBC and you see the United States and the West making a big deal about one Jordanian airman, but saying not a word about whole families, guess who you see as your friend and guess who you see as your enemy? ISIS is billing itself as the custodian and the last line of defense, the guarantors of Sunni security. And the political project here, I mean, the Atlanta cover story by Graham Wood and then the counter responses that engendered, that was a good, useful debate, but I think it misses a trick. Did the leadership of ISIS want to usher in Armageddon and the end of the world? You're going to tell me that Iraqi generals under Saddam who went in 1 year's time from wearing military fatigues, drinking wine, smoking cigars, and having 12 mistresses to now being in the dishdasha with the long black beard, they want the end of the world? No. They want restoration. They want to reclaim Baghdad, and then they want to sack Damascus. And they think that is going to happen. That is the plausible theory behind what is driving a lot of this. As for the rank and file, the willing executioners of ISIS, many of them do. They want to usher in the end of the world. This is an apocalyptic mission. That's the marketing component to it. So with that rather daunting and dire surmise, I mean, I turn it over to you, Warren, I guess?
Absolutely, yeah. I'm going to keep it going with a couple of questions, and then we'll get the audience involved. Michael, that's quite an analysis, and I'm glad you continued on through it because you never lost the train of it. Is it possible, in thinking about ISIS somehow relinquishing the kind of control it has right now, is it possible to imagine an implosion? By this I mean ISIS must control territory. It now controls territory. At some point, if its governance, which apparently is pretty good in the beginning, but then begins to break down.
Right.
Also, if that governance is no longer fueled by oil profits, and I understand they are now diminishing, does that present the possibility of ISIS imploding from within?
Yes, there was a very credible report about 6 weeks ago that there was actually an internal coup attempt in the upper echelons. ISIS has it has pretensions of being an actual government, and they have councils. So the most important council is the Shura Council, which is responsible for choosing the emir, or now, as he likes to call himself, the caliph. There was an alleged plot of someone, or a faction within there trying to take over another faction. There's no doubt they've been battered. They've been battered by U.S. airstrikes. They've been humiliated in some cases by the tactical loss of terrain. You're quite right. The oil revenue, these numbers, anyone who tells you they know exactly what the financial situation of ISIS is, they don't know what they're talking about. At best, it's speculation. I've heard, and I'll use it because it's a U.S. government source, they went from making about $3 million a day just through petrol to $1 million a day as a result of the U.S. bombing the oil refineries and also just kind of the interdiction, the financial sanction stuff that we're really good at. My problem with this is, why does ISIS really conquer territory? They claim they want to be a government, and yes, that's partly true, but actually they make a lot of their money by taxing people. So the more terrain you conquer, the more populations are in thrall to you, the more taxes you make. That's just a materialist kind of conception of it. It's in the book. So if you're a farmer in Aleppo, or better yet in Raqqa, and you have 100 head of sheep, ISIS can come in and say, give us 10, or pay us in cash, or pay us in some sort of in-kind contribution. So the loss of terrain hurts them financially. But if you want to get into sort of the nitty-gritty of it, look, they just lost Tikrit, but how did they lose it? Under what circumstances? This was an operation that was launched a month ago, or actually it took a month for the city to fall, launched exclusively by Baghdad and Tehran without a buyer leave from Washington at all, no consultations with CENTCOM. The Shia militia groups under the heading of Hashd al-Shabi, or the Popular Mobilization Forces, said that this city will fall within days. Tikrit was being held by 400 to 700 ISIS militants. And after 3 weeks of really being badly bled, I mean, I've heard as many as 6,000 killed in action by Hashd al-Shabi, the whole thing ground to a halt. And then, rather meekly, Baghdad came to Washington and said, can you please conduct airstrikes on Tikrit? And that sort of loosened it up, and then Tikrit finally fell. The problem with seeing this in too optimistic terms is we've been down this road before. When the US liberated Fallujah the second time in 2004, I forget the actual ordnance, the amount that was dropped on this one city, thousands upon thousands of tons. It looked like a pocked moonscape. But again, only a few hundred AQI guys and other insurgency groups holding their ground against not Hashd al-Shabi, but the greatest military known to man, namely the US military, including Marines. By the first week of major combat operations in Fallujah, AQI had already set up shop in Mosul. So they make these preparations. And then when the city eventually fell, it was even bin Laden himself came out and said, this is a great propaganda victory for us because whilst we lost, the legacy or the names of these mujahideen will be written in the stars. And look what we did. We bled the great Crusader army white. Now they're doing the same thing with Shia militias and the Iraqi security forces. So ISIS doesn't see this necessarily as, I mean, it's bad that they lose terrain, but it's not, the end game for them. What I find interesting now is, sorry, I think they do seem to be suing for peace in a very sort of tactical manner. Apparently, there's been reports in the Iraqi Kurdish media that they want a truce with the Peshmerga. Peshmerga have been killing them probably better than anyone else. There's also in Dabek, the latest issue of their propaganda magazine, sort of a call for kind of a global truce. They seek legitimacy. Be under no misapprehension about that. The whole pantomime negotiation about the fate of Muaz al-Qasasbah, the Jordanian pilot they killed, what did they do there? They were talking to Jordan saying, we'll release the Japanese hostage, and I forget who the other one was, if we get a good deal from you. Of course, they'd already killed Qasasbah a month before, but they were conducting this pantomime negotiation because by dint of just talking to them, Jordan had legitimated them as not a terrorist organization, but as an insurgency. So they were following the US debate about the Taliban, which has technically been considered an insurgency since 2001, very, very closely. If they can get that kind of status from the US, that means all kinds of bartering can go on, including the trading of kidnapped hostages and the like. The European Union, one of the ways they made a lot of their money, this doesn't get reported, and for understandable human rights considerations, European Union countries have paid hundreds of millions of dollars to ISIS to get back kidnapped journalists and aid workers, most of whom you don't know the names of for good reason, because this was all done sub rosa. But they're running out of European and American captives, right? So what happens then? I've heard, I mean, just to give you a sense of the lows to which they will sink, James Foley, the American journalist that they brutally beheaded, they're apparently trying to auction his remains on the black market for $1 million. So they'll resort to any means necessary. You've seen all the powdering of the Iraqi cultural artifacts, going back from the pre-Islamic. So they claim, well, if it's a pre-Islamic worshipped piece of art, we'll smash it. But anything else, they trade for money on the black market. So again, there is a materialist or a pragmatic component to what, at first glance, can seem to be an uncompromising or messianic vision. They're not so stupid as they don't want to make a buck.
Michael, how are they militarily so good? We've seen them, they're skilled at propaganda, they're skilled at social media. We've seen some evidence, I'm going to ask you about this also, about how well they tend to govern at some point when they have governance. But how are they militarily? And is the answer that they have all those old Iraqi officers running the military?
That's part of it for sure. I've talked to Pentagon officials past and present who say, if you look at the way they mobilize, this is not some ragtag contingent of, spotty 14-year-olds from Tunisia or something. These guys, they operate like a real army. Some of the people that join aren't even from the Iraqi army. The field commander, the emir of northern Aleppo, al-Shishani, His name means he's Chechen, but he's not really. He's actually from Georgia. He was a member of the Georgian military, actually trained by the United States military. So this guy has, he has tactical and combat training. His myth has been so inflated, particularly by the Western tabloid press. He's not quite as good as everyone makes out, but still better than, again, the average kid who wants to go over and do jihad. Absolutely. The other thing they do, people wonder, how does so few control so many? This is just a very hypothetical example. I'm not speaking specifically about any town or city. Let's say you have a small, scruffy little village in Iraq, home to about 1,000 people. ISIS can come in with 30 guys and say, right, now you work for us. And the townsmen can thunder and grumble and maybe even wage an armed rebellion against them. So ISIS takes the sheikh or the mayor or whomever is the kind of elder of the town, and they kill him and they cut his head off and they put the head on a pike in the town square. And they say, right, as we were saying, now you work for us. So people pledge allegiance out of fear and a sense of submission. And again, this is all faute de mieux. This is all for lack of a better alternative. Sunnis would rise up against ISIS tomorrow if they thought there was somebody else waiting in the wings to enfranchise them and to empower them. Right now, they don't. That includes Mosul Alawis. Right now, we don't hear about this because it's happening at a sort of underground level. People in Mosul are rebelling against ISIS in innumerable and creative ways. And eventually, that city will be liberated. The question is by whom? And the danger is if it's by Hashd al-Shaabi and Iranian proxies, then you're going to have a big, big problem in Iraq. Because the minority will not just be ruled by a supremacist majority, but they will resort to terrorism to resist that kind of occupation. And if it's not ISIS, then it'll be some other contingent.
I mentioned that the book is anecdotal, and it really is. Let me just ask you about two of them quickly, because I think the audience would be privileged to hear them. One is, I've got the note to myself here, one is the young man who tells you, or you overhear him telling other people, that he believes it is his right to rape.
Yeah, that's Abdulaziz.
Yeah, can you just expand upon that a little bit about that?
This was the guy who was mentioned, the Bahraini, who didn't even consider himself to be a pious Muslim. ISIS gave him religion. You can find references. I mean, part of this debate we've been having about is ISIS Islamic, is it not Islamic? I think it's quite stupid to deny an Islamic caste or component to ISIS. Why? Because they don't deny it, and nor do all the Arab governments in this coalition deny it. And how do we know that? Because Jordan, for instance, is using Salafi jihadis to parlay with ISIS. Salafi jihadis they deem to be more moderate or less ultrist in ambition, such as al-Maqdisi, the guy who was negotiating with ISIS over the fate of Muazzez al-Qasasbah. Who is al-Maqdisi? None other than Abu Musab al-Zarqawi's mentor, who was mysteriously let out of prison by the Jordanian government, which of course means he's being run by the GID. So Abdulaziz says to us, he took a Yazidi woman, actually a girl, as a sex slave. And I forget I don't like to pay too much attention to this stuff, but the numerical breakdown of it, if you take X number of Yazidi women or girls are handed over to the emir or ISIS Central to be passed around, and then you get to keep one, but then you have to share her. It's really disgusting and terrifying. He was talking about this as though he was doing his IRS tax returns. And we said, he's like, oh, no, this is all you can find this in the Islamic faith and traditions and the Quran, conquest of the land of the infidels you can take. They consider the Yazidis to be devil worshippers. So not even Christians, not even people of the book. If you're Christian, you certainly don't want to be conquered by ISIS, but there is a dispensation. Like for Muslims, it's zakat, you pay the tax. For Christians, it's jizya, you pay a tax for the people of the book, but not necessarily somebody who has to be beheaded. This was terrifying. He also told us, we put to him the hypothetical, what if you encountered your father on the battlefield? What if he was in the FSA and you were fighting him in ISIS? He said, I'd kill him. He's your own father. Yeah, well, he's kuffar now. This is not a real Muslim. The capacity for brainwashing, the capacity for them to completely give you a worldview. This might sound a little bit flip, but it really isn't. The other night I was watching the documentary on Scientology, Going Clear. Watch that documentary and see well-educated, reasonable, normal people describe the most ludicrous things imaginable and also tell you we didn't start out this way. We were initiated, the sort of preliminaries seemed quite normal and rational, and then all of a sudden we got sucked in, and 10 years later, we believe space aliens colonized the planet with Mitsubishis or whatever the hell they believe. With ISIS, and this is something that is replicated with other Islamist movements such as Hizb ut-Tahrir, which is considered to be a, quote, non-violent Islamist organization. They have all the time in the world. When you come to them, they don't put a gun to your head and say, join us or die. In fact, they actually welcome being interrogated. They actually welcome the challenge and the criticism. They want to break you down psychologically and build you back up in their own image. And that process can take weeks, it can take months, it can take years. One of the other reasons that they have succeeded so well, as the war in Syria has fallen into this sort of attritional chaos, it's true, other rebel brigades, Islamist, secular, whatever, resorted to brigandry, they resorted to criminality, they did rape, they did murder. ISIS posed themselves as the law and order faction, bringing discipline to the town that was lawless. So normal Syrians, non-religious Muslims, non-Islamists say, if ISIS means that the trash will be picked up and my daughter isn't going to be picked up off the street and raped, then fine, we'll do a deal with ISIS, no problem. I've been talking to a lot of people who have gone through a lot of permutations in this conflict. Activists, FSA, they join ISIS. Why do you join ISIS? And, you can get the pro forma, Islamist caliphate bullshit to start, but it doesn't always, once you start really interrogating them or asking them, they begin to get into materialist ideas. Well, I was with this FSA guy, but we think he was working for the regime, or this one, he said I can raise you, 1,000 AK-47s from Libya, and he didn't deliver, all the kind of the fratricidal chaos of the region. And then you realize ISIS it's very simple. They have money, they have discipline, they have power, and they have weapons. And they're very good, and they're not stupid. They don't fight the regime. They fight other FSA factions and units that are already in disarray. And the way they do it is also quite strategically brilliant. They send in sleepers, they send in agents to recruit in a town that's held by some other faction. And those agents quietly build a constituency such that when either the townspeople rebel against the faction or when ISIS just sends in a very small armed contingent, you already have a willing population to join up with you. They did this in Mosul. Everyone thinks, it was a blitzkrieg, it took 72 hours. No, it took months. They were in Mosul before they were in Mosul.
One last question before we go to the audience. You've made a powerful argument for the fact that the United States, by its actions right now, is feeding the narrative of being on the side of the Shia against the Sunnis. How can you imagine advising the United States on how to reverse that narrative?
Yes, well, unfortunately, I think Syria is so hopelessly destroyed. The amount of commitment by this country to even do anything approaching rebuilding it or saving it, the American electorate hasn't got the stomach for it. Even if we did, I don't know that it could be done, truthfully. And that's somebody who very much sympathized with the goals of the protest movement in the early days of the revolution, and I have a lot of Syrian friends. But there is one thing you could do, or we could do, which wouldn't be particularly daunting from a military perspective or from a budgetary one, which is impose at least a de facto no-fly zone in northern Syria such that Assad can't drop barrel bombs on the people of Aleppo and blow up bakeries and just kill people with grim abandon. Why do I say this can be done? Well, because you have U.S. warplanes flying in the skies of Syria already, including in the areas they claimed they weren't going to be, which is the areas free of ISIS. This war started, we're going to go after ISIS, but actually we've been hitting other factions, including Jabhat al-Nusra. Now you can say, well, that's fine, they're al-Qaeda. But Ahrar al-Sham, which is not a designated terrorist organization, we hit them too. Again, bad narrative for the Sunnis. If the U.S. does something tangible, and I don't mean rhetoric or a speech, I mean really goes in there and protects the population from Assad and also from ISIS, I think that could have a discernible impact. I'm not saying it's going to change everything. I'm not saying ISIS is going to, die on the vine, but at least you're going to start to regain some of the faith and confidence of the people. I mean, look, in the beginning, the Syrian protesters were burning which flags? Russian, Iranian, Hezbollah flags. Now the same people are burning American flags. So it took 4 years, but hooray, we did it. Mission accomplished. They hate us. To win them back takes a lot of energy and effort. And the reason why we're not doing it, Pentagon has been very clear. Well, if we go after Assad or his proxies in Syria, we will so piss off Iran that their proxies in Iraq will target American soldiers. Seriously, I'm not making it up. It's in the Wall Street Journal. That's the logic. So the U.S. has to ask Iran's permission to conduct foreign policy in Syria. Again, Sunnis in Syria read the Wall Street Journal. They can discern exactly what I just said, thus contributing to this grand conspiracy theory: America hates us and they like the Shia. There are plenty of Shia, by the way, in Iraq. I'm not, by trying to anatomize the conflict, sometimes people think I'm being prescriptivist in this. This is not true. The Ayad Alawi, who's now the Minister for Reconciliation of all things, former interim prime minister, is himself a Shia, he says, we've been ethnically cleansing Baghdad of Sunnis. All these war crimes that are being committed by Hashd al-Shabi in the country, there's a lot of Shia who stand up and say this is barbarous, including, by the way, Muqtada al-Sadr, not somebody I ever thought I would be patting on the back, but even he is less interested and comfortable being in a state of thraldom to Iran than the United States is. So, but these are simple measures that can be undertaken. Unfortunately, what we're doing now, building up this sort of, not even an army, a platoon, 5,000 Syrian rebels per year, maybe if we're lucky, to go after only ISIS, but if they turn their guns on Assad or the IRGC or Hezbollah in Syria, then we have to get the lawyers involved, and it's a big pain in the ass. That is a recipe for disaster. That is an absolute, and by the way, lo and behold, we're having a problem finding rebels who want to sign up for this project. Why should the United States create Arab JSOC teams to conduct U.S. counterterrorism policy? I mean, you talk about Orientalism. This is not the way to win hearts and minds.
Excellent. I'd love to get some questions. If you raise your hand, I'll call on you. I think Michael will take sort of three at once. So listen and answer. We'll start with you, number one, number two there, right, and then do I have someone in the back? And then Craig Charney in the back. 1, 2, 3.
Thank you. I'll get right to the point.
Sure.
In the 1980s, our United States government played off the Sunnis versus the Shia. We wanted to have them both bleed each other. Saddam Hussein as the Sunni running Iraq, fighting the Shiite run Iran. What has changed from your analysis to have our administration favor the Shia of Iran?
Okay, hold that thought. The second was, this gentleman right here. I should ask you, could you please identify yourself? And it might be helpful to stand up because we've got so many people in the back.
Carlos Hernandez. I'm an intern with the UNRWA Roni's office here. That's the representative's office. My question is, in terms of the message the U.S. is sending to Sunnis, Yemen, what does our support opposing the Houthis do for that message?
Okay, and the third is Craig in the back.
Michael, I was struck by your comparison of...
By the way, Craig, I know who you are.
Charney, I'm a senior advisor to IPI, and I run the survey research firm Charney Research, which has recently worked in Syria, among other places.
Okay.
I was really struck by your comparison of ISIS to the early Soviet Union. It's occurred to me, too, and there are two dimensions I wanted to ask you about. One is the idea that this is somehow the motherland, the socialist motherland in the one case, the Islamic motherland in the other, and that, rather than the notion of a death cult as the source of its appeal. The other is the fact that just like the earlier Soviet Union, which envisaged the adhesion of other states, so too we have this sort of modularity of the Islamic State where we see people in places like Nigeria or Libya or other places proclaiming their adherence to it. Do you take that seriously, or do you simply see it as basically a Levantine phenomenon?
Sure.
All right.
Well, let me take them in reverse because it's in the book. I mean, I do make that comparison. At one point, we're interviewing, I forget whom, an ISIS fighter who is giving us this sense of, having sort of been completely brainwashed and seen the true cause of the revolution through the eyes of ISIS clerics. And it reminded me of the end of Darkness at Noon. Rubashov is going to his death, and he recalls, actually misremembers a passage in his own memoir. And it says something like, we are past the ethical ballast of, the 19th century. And so, in other words, all the morality, your false consciousness is taken away from you. And you are seeing the world anew. And that's not just something that's resonant with Soviet communism. I mean, if you read Orwell's review of Mein Kampf in 1940, he says, I don't understand. How is it that the most industrialized, civilized nation in Western Europe bows down before somebody who says, I offer you death? So, well, what happens when the late failure of radical hopes and liberal democracy turns to ash? Strong men come along with a very tidy understanding of how the world works. They promise you absolution. They promise you heaven either on earth or afterward, and you bow down. Understanding, I keep saying one of the problems that U.S. foreign policy has today, we are thinking in a past-Cold War, post-Cold War mentality, but a little too much for our own good. Students of totalitarianism would have a better go at understanding ISIS, the appeal, and how to fight it than people who, all they know is counterterrorism. So absolutely 100% I agree, and you're quite right. The exportation of the revolution is something that they're very good at. In Libya, how did they get their faction there? Al-Anbari, a Saddam Mukhabarat officer. I mean, here you even have a historical parallel. I mean, Baathism is in a sense a marriage of National Socialism and also Soviet communism. Al-Anbari sent a delegation and recruited these guys away from Al-Qaeda. The information warfare as well that ISIS conducts, the way they pay attention to Western policy debates, the way that they package their slickly produced propaganda. If these guys were in Saddam's intelligence services, then who trained them? KGB, right? I forget the second question. Which one was this?
Well, the second was Yemen, wasn't it?
Oh, Yemen, yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, superficially, this looks sort of completely paradoxical and weird, right? Why is the U.S. backing a sort of Saudi-led Sunni enterprise in Yemen against Iranian-controlled Houthis? Doesn't this put paid to the theory? I think, look, the U.S. had no idea this was going to happen. Lloyd Austin, the head of CENTCOM, commander, told Bloomberg, or I think he told Congress, and Bloomberg reported it, that Operation Decisive Storm got underway an hour before the United States was made aware of it. I actually think your point works in reverse. The Saudis and the GCC assembled this coalition, the first Arab war waged since, I think 1973, and not against Israel, but another Arab state. They did this as a signal not to even Iran so much as the United States. Fine, you want to absent yourself from Pax Americana, your own condominium in the region, you want to pivot not to Asia but to the Islamic Republic, then we're going to do business our own way now. So this is in a sense a Sunni power projection policy aimed against the United States. I don't think this campaign would have got underway if we didn't have sort of the current foreign policy dynamic. Look, a senior State Department official told me a few weeks ago, rapprochement, that is the goal. And it's with Tehran, nobody else. There's a high-level Washington, actually White House official who goes around saying to people, the problem in the Middle East is the Saudis, the Qataris, the Kuwaitis, and the solution is the Iranians, because they're good at counterinsurgency. And actually, this dovetails perfectly with your query. Yes, the Iran-Iraq war, which is actually still going on, it's just in different terrain now and in different swapping of players. Henry Kissinger's line, it's a shame they can't both lose, meaning Saddam and... you have, I think it was Dennis McDonough, who was quoted, who's also now White House Chief of Staff, was quoted in the New York Times a few years ago saying, hey, in Syria it's not so bad because we've got Al-Qaeda fighting Hezbollah. Both our enemies, let them bleed each other. Rather callous concern for the lives of the innocent people who are going to be bled as well, isn't it? Yeah, look, my problem with realism is it can often grade into magical realism. And if your idea is to disenfranchise or piss off or alienate or turn against you the majority in the region in favor of the minority, you're incurring a pretty heavy debt. I don't think, by the way, and I just want to be very clear because I know this is being broadcast and I can imagine what my Twitter feed is going to look like later. This is not U.S. policy. It's not to say Shia good, Sunni bad. I want to be very clear about that. That's the conspiracy theory. The policy is Iran is a more stable state. The way they do things is better. I don't think the U.S. delves into Islamic theology. I hope they don't delve into Islamic theology. But again, politics is perception, especially in the Middle East. And if you listen to people in the region, the Sunnis in particular, this is what they believe. So if this is what they believe, then actions will follow. And yeah, I think we're going down a very dark path here. And that's not to say I'm against a framework agreement with Iran on the nuclear file. If it was only about that, I would be less exercised than I am. I think it's about so much more.
By the way, the Shia minority is acting with enormous confidence.
Too much so.
For a minority. Is that
Yes.
because they know they have Iran behind them?
That, and also, I mean, don't underestimate the rallying power of ideology. I mean, most of these militia groups are Khomeinist in orientation. You go to Baghdad today, and where there used to be Saddam Hussein posters, you got pictures of Ayatollah Khomeini and Khamenei. Qasem Soleimani, the commander of the Quds Force, the hardest working man in show business, waging 4 wars all at once. He's a hero. They want to erect a bust to him in Baghdad. So yes, they see Iran standing behind them, but again, much like AQI, they overshot the mark, or they overplayed their hand. They said Tikrit will fall in days. It took 3 weeks, and it was closer to 30,000 forces, of which 25,000 were Shia militia groups. So that means only 5,000 were Iraqi security forces and other auxiliaries. Against that, 400 to 700 ISIS guys held their ground. So now you come home from that conflict, 6,000 of your boys, your volunteers have been slaughtered. How many are going to line up to want to take Mosul, which is a town of 1 to 2 million? We don't know the actual numbers because of the refugee population. And that's going to make Tikrit look like a walk in the park. So yeah, I mean, from the US perspective, oh, this is actually nice because now it shows Iran can't win. But it doesn't matter, because if the US is working with Iran to help Iran win, you're still handing the country to Iran.
We'll take a couple more questions. This gentleman, you had a question before. Okay, very good. In the back, in the blue shirt, number 1, and woman right there, number 2. And do I have a third? Number 3 over here. Go. And please identify yourself.
Yeah, Eckhard Schieweg. I work for the Al-Qaeda Taliban monitoring team at the Security Council Assistance Division. And my question is how you would see the potential in the fight or competition between Jabhat al-Nusra and ISIL.
Well, so there's a...
Sorry. Let's take one.
Yeah.
The Al-Nusra, that's a good question. I was going to
write it
ask the same thing if nobody did. Please, this young woman here. Wait for the microphone and identify yourself, please.
My name's Tracy Durner from the Global Center on Cooperative Security. Sort of in follow-up to the second of your question, I'd love your thoughts on the potential for a disaggregated expansion of ISIS, particularly with some of the African Islamic groups, such as Boko Haram or even Al-Shabaab, although they have technically pledged allegiance to Al-Qaeda.
Mm-hmm. And the third question, yes, right here.
My name is Ali Ahmed. I'm from the United Nations Department of Political Affairs. You painted a rather bleak picture of Syria, and I just wanted to ask what your opinion was about Iraq and the future of Iraq. I've seen reports from Sunni elders saying that Iraq would not continue on as a single state. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are in the near-term future for Iraq.
Okay, Al-Nusra.
Sure. So there have been a lot of media reports that there might be some reconciliation between Nusra and ISIS. Most recently, the ISIS takeover of, 95%, maybe 100% now, of Yarmouk, the Palestinian refugee camp in Damascus. The allegations were that Nusra was working alongside ISIS. I actually think it's a little more complicated than that. I think Jaish al-Islam, which is the independent Islamist brigade that opposes, mostly ISIS, but has some friction with Nusra. They were the sort of the bigger fish to fry there. I don't see reconciliation taking place. I think you're going to see some tactical coordination on the ground. When the U.S. started bombing both organizations, there was some messaging of solidarity. In fact, in some instances, ISIS may have sent some material and even some personnel to help Nusra. But look at the propaganda. So I think it's 2 issues of Dabik, the ISIS magazine. They had a very interesting cover story, which was about what? A guy returning from Waziristan saying that the Al-Qaeda Emirate project in Pakistan had failed. And he was saying the reason it failed is that Al-Qaeda, it's all just... It's posturing. These guys are actually allowing the government to run schools, women walk the streets without hijab, or they, a little too freely. Now compare this to the glories of the caliphate in Raqqa and Mosul, and the discipline and the structure and the hierarchical organization is vastly superior. So I think the ideological differences and the bad blood is just too extensive for any kind of major strategic reconciliation. If there were such a thing, that would be easy and good for the United States, because that means you're targeting the same people and not having to disambiguate. But the other thing with Nusra is they have widespread Syrian support, because they're not seen as a terror organization. They're seen as a formidable insurgency fighting the regime, unlike ISIS, which fights the Syrian people and other FSA factions. So another reason why Nusra is, I think, playing its own game and rather well. Unfortunately, with the war against ISIS, degrading ISIS, leaving the regime, means that Nusra is the other franchise that rises instead of moderate nationalists. The second question,
Africa.
ISIS, yeah. Well, it's extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, I forget what the actual percentage is now, but there was a very good Iraqi security consultant who I trust, and we quote him in the book, who told us when we filed the book, only about 3% of the caliphate has been lost through the coalition warfare. So that was like 7 or 8 months of intense aerial bombardment. This was a little bit before Kobani fell. But let's throw in Kobani, let's throw in Tikrit in the mix. How much terrain has ISIS lost? It's probably still under 10%. The Pentagon figures I don't believe, and I know people in the Pentagon who also don't believe them. With the stroke of a pen, metaphorically speaking, ISIS gained 20,000 square miles of terrain in West Africa when Boko Haram pledged allegiance. So again, all the fire and metal that goes into defeating them militarily, and at the political or the ideological level, they're plying their trade quite nicely. I think there was an analysis done by David Gartenstein-Ross at Foundation for Defense of Democracies, who says that AQAP, or rather Al-Qaeda, controls way more territory in the region than ISIS does. That may be true, and it may be true that Al-Qaeda wins in this kind of fratricidal jihadi conflict. But the point is, we're throwing everything we can at ISIS, and we're making a dent, but we haven't really sort of breached the hull. And yeah, isn't it interesting? Today, I think a top Libyan cleric pledged allegiance to ISIS. Why? When you're at war with the United States and also a coalition of Taghut, tyrannical, apostate Arab regimes, everyone's out to get you, and you're the defender of the Sunni Ummah, people will bow down before you. It has all the right markings. The narrative is quite good. I'm not an expert, unfortunately, on African jihadism. I don't know where they'll turn up next. They're in Yemen, we know. The Tunisian factor, this is getting more into MENA than Africa, but the Tunisian factor is quite pronounced. I was talking to a Tunisian MP, something like 3,000 foreign fighters from Tunisia, of which maybe 500 to 600 have returned home. Might have conducted already a terrorist operation in the form of the museum bombing. They're extremely worried about this. Yeah, and Al-Shabaab, I mean, I think they're very much part of the Al-Qaeda firmament, but things change. And again, it's easiest for ISIS to take away from Al-Qaeda, right? In the great jihadi competition, you go after those who are already on your side ideologically, or there's the narcissism of the tiny difference, rather than creating people, whole cloth. Future of Iraq.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, look, in a de facto sense, if not de jure, the country has already balkanized. The Kurds, the first thing that Peshmerga did when the siege of Mosul happened and its immediate aftermath was what? They took Kirkuk, their Jerusalem. So now they've gone beyond the Green Line. They're never going to give Kirkuk up. They don't have to, because nobody can effectively challenge them for it. The real question is what the future of the ground offensive against ISIS will hold. So now you have Shia militias in possession of Tikrit. They have billed that seizure of Saddam Hussein's hometown as a continuation of the 1991 uprising against Saddam. Also puts the Sunnis a bit on the back foot to hear that. Are they going to take Mosul? If they do, who's going to occupy Mosul, and what happens to the residents? Part of the problem is the militias come in, they consider every military-aged male Sunni to be a collaborator of Daesh, and they either burn the houses to the ground or they ethnically cleanse the territory. They don't allow these people to return. The Iraqi government says we're looking into this, we're investigating, but the problem is the ministries, the people who would be doing the investigations, are also running the Shia militia groups, and they're also Iranian spies. I have a very dismal view of the future of Iraq. I don't think Humpty Dumpty gets put back together again, unfortunately. I do think eventually, not in the next 2 years, maybe not in the next 5, but I think eventually the U.S. is going to have boots on the ground in either one or maybe both of these countries. And it won't be because we want it to, if you see what I mean.
Michael, I'm going to take one last question from a colleague of mine, John Hirsch. Well, okay, I was going to call on John Hirsch first, and then Sally second, and then in the back, we'll do three last ones. I want to give him a chance to buy books and chat with Michael, so.
First of all, thank you very much. About 80 or 90% of your analysis has had to do with sort of geography and politics among all these groups in Syria, Iraq, and Iran. and you've said relatively little about the caliphate. I've heard almost, I mean, you referred to it, but so is this really, it'd be interesting to have your analysis. Are the people who are, whatever you say, running ISIS really interested in a caliphate, or are they interested in most of the things that you've already talked about, which is money, power, control, armaments, and so on? I mean, is the caliphate a kind of a facade in all of this, and this is really just a power struggle between 6 or 7 different groups, and the U.S. is making or not making mistakes in siding with one or another?
Okay, then the gentleman in the back who I called on. Wait for the microphone, please.
My name is Stephen Byro. My question is, this mess that you have described, why should we be there at all in any way?
Excellent. And finally, Sally, you'll be the last one, okay? Here in the second row.
Thank you for this very informative explanation about what's going on. My name is Sally Cater, and I represent the U.S. Federation for Middle East Peace. We have lived also in Iraq with the United Nations ESQA headquarters that was then in Iraq, and my husband was a hostage there during the Saddam regime. And at that time, because he was an American citizen, so Kofi Annan went and got the American citizen, the British nationals, to come out as they are international civil servants. My question is that from all the Iraqis that I have seen and met recently, they are all against ISIS. So I know it's all economical and so on, and I've heard all kinds of stuff. When we lived there, we used to fill our car for, there was a big gas tank for a couple of dollars. Now they are in queue. There's no food. There's a lot of problems that they have. So they are not better off at all. So they're all trying to leave. So what's the incentive for ISIS to stay there and for the people who are seeing what's going on in their name? And I just don't see it. How do they still stay with them? Sure. Thank you.
Okay. 5 minutes to answer those 3 questions, Michael, and then we'll take a break.
The caliphate, yes. If you look at their propaganda, the images that they contrive, they have the black Shahada flag covering the globe. If they had their druthers, they would say, we invade the United States and take over the White House. Do the leadership really believe that that's attainable? No. Do young Muslim recruits to ISIS, the rank and file, the spotty 14-year-old Tunisians believe it? Sure. That's where ideology and pragmatism sort of collide. Again, they're great marketers. They know how to sell jihad and to sell themselves as the vanguard contingent. So that when I don't talk about the caliphate, there's no caliphate. This is a construct, but it's one that's very adroitly implemented. The question, why should we do anything? Was it Trotsky who said, you may not be interested in the dialectic, but the dialectic is interested in you? You may not be interested in the Middle East, but the Middle East is interested in you. Do nothing, fine. I can understand the reasoning. I certainly understand the American electorate's war weariness, but it will come home. I think it's going to come home anyway. The best we can do is try and manage and mitigate the problem. Again, the good news is it actually requires less military effort than it might seem, more of a political effort. I mean, my criticism of the administration is not even the withdrawal militarily from Iraq. It was the political disengagement, the acquiescence to Maliki, the way the State Department was running the Green Zone in 2010, 2011. Anbar awakening sheikhs, Sunni council or Sunni tribes coming to America saying, this guy is Saddam Light, he's a Shia strongman, help us. The response was, sorry, you're a sovereign country, pat on the back, you figure it out. And they looked at them dumbfounded, like, you guys came in here and you broke this country and now you refuse to help us fix it. So that can be done without boots on the ground. Do I have confidence that we're capable or competent enough to do it? No. Iraqis against ISIS? Absolutely. But here's the thing. The main bulwark of ISIS propaganda geared toward Arabs is what? If you join with the awakening or with the councils that worked with the Crusader American army or with Baghdad, we're coming after you first. So they have a video called Clanging of the Swords. This is like a twisted episode of that series Cops. They go posing as Iraqi security force personnel, house to house, all the sheikhs that worked for the Sawha awakening councils. And these guys think, oh, it's Iraqi security force. What are you doing here? They interrogate them on camera. They take them out to a field with their sons. They make the sheikhs and the sons dig a mass grave, and then they repent and confess on camera, and then they execute them and cut their heads off. That is counterposed with an image of a mass repentance rally. So in the mosques of Mosul, Fallujah, whatever, they go in and they say, listen, if you were part of the awakening, all is forgiven. If you come in now, tear up your security ID badge or whatever, hand in your guns, and pledge allegiance to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. And scores of people have done this, and it's sort of like a Mooney kind of rally. And they say, but you better come to us before we get to you. So now put yourself in the shoes. Who are you going to wait for? You hate Daesh. You think they're scum. They are. You've seen what they do. But it's wait and be liberated by the Badr Corps, Asaib al-Haq, or Lebanese Hezbollah. They're going to burn your house to the ground. They're going to say, you stayed in this village, you were alive, ISIS didn't kill you, that means you're ISIS, kill him. I've seen videos that, the militias can be as brutal as ISIS. So again, put yourself in the shoes of the Sunni. What can I do? I can leave the country if I have the means, or I can stay and just pray to God nobody comes after me, either ISIS or the government or Iran. So this is a Hobson's choice. I don't envy anybody. But try to put myself in that position. I don't know what I would do. So yeah, I mean, it's not about Iraqis are pro-ISIS. Of course not. I mean, I think they made in the north and in the central part of the country, they made a strategically stupid decision to allow these guys back in. But again, it's intelligible, that decision, given what Maliki was doing and the way he was disenfranchising them politically and also militarily. So yeah, I mean, that's again. This is a mafia. It's a totalitarian political organization. It's a terrorist army. But you have to take all three at once. You can't just take one plank of that argument and try to defeat them. It's not going to work.
I'm going to call a halt now because I want you to have a chance to buy books. Again, it's only $15. It's a paperback. And I'm going to keep Michael here. I'll give him a glass of wine, and he can sign the books sitting right here. And I just want to say, Michael, I was thinking as you were talking, it's like taking a cold shower. I mean, it's not fun when it's happening, but I think we're all better off right now having it stated as clearly as you have. Thank you so much. That's a brilliant analysis.
Sure,
I'm glad you came to share it with us.
Cheers. Thank you, Warren.